Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to discuss what it's like to buy and to own a Dodge Viper, including not only the good and the bad, but also just the unexpected. For anyone new to my channel, I purchased my attainable dream car, which was a 2004 Dodge Viper SRT10 back in late 2019. At the time, it was the cheapest one in the country, but it was still the top end of my budget. I didn't want to film this video immediately after buying this car. I wanted to get a very good perspective, more long-term, of what it's actually like to own this. So I bought the car more than a year ago, and I've also racked up a number of miles. I think I did something like 1,000 miles in the first 5 or so months that I had the car. But that said, this is a Gen 3 Viper that I own. Some of the stuff that we're going to discuss is going to be a little more Gen 3 specific, but most of it is going to apply to any generation of Viper because a lot of the stuff does overlap. Because they're all in that generally broader category of budget exotic supercar that is just a V10 absurdity and kind of the ultimate driver's car. Quick crash course on the Viper generations for anyone who's not aware. The first generation Viper was basically like a half step above a kit car. The best way I've heard it described is like if you LS swapped a Mazda Miata in your own garage. That's the level of build quality and the level of absolute absurdity and how the chassis, I've heard, feels like it's not meant for that much power. And then as the generations went on, as the years progressed, they refined the car a little bit and they added a little bit of niceties here and there, like air conditioning and airbags, partially because that's what was federally required, but then also partially because this was a $100,000 car, and at $100,000, you kind of expect to have things like air conditioning in it. So really the car wouldn't have sold any if you didn't have some sort of compromises in the long run. And with that, the first thing to get out of the way is that the Viper, no matter what generation you get, is not necessarily a luxury car, but the newer the generation that you get, the more refined it will be. Even the Gen 3, which is the one I have, a lot of plastics and stuff on the interior. The knobs and the radio is probably the same as you got in like a Dodge Neon of the same era, but that's not why you're buying the car. You're buying it because it's a V10 monster and all these other things are just kind of nice to haves that were thrown in as an afterthought. With that in mind, all generations of Viper are best described as a vehicle of absolute excess. It's like the design team, when they sat down, they said, what do we have and how can we add more of it? V8 muscle cars were like the American standard. They were like, nope, that's not enough. Let's add 2 more cylinders. What's the displacement of a Ferrari V10? We're gonna go more than that. How big of brakes can we fit? Let's go bigger. Although the caveat to that is that the very first generation, I've heard the brakes are not great. This is gonna come up in a few different places throughout the video, but just know that everything about this car is completely built on excess. There's 6 lugs on the wheels. Everything is overkill. It is absolutely insane. Now, the other way to best describe this car is that it is basically a motorcycle. And in another video, I did a full discussion on whether or not I think the Dodge Viper is dangerous. I gave a lot more details in that video, but basically everything about the Viper from a driver's aids perspective and from a level of protection perspective, it's pretty much equivalent to a motorcycle. It's disgustingly fast, but only when it's in the hands of a capable operator. And also, if something happens and something goes awry, there's not a whole lot in place to protect you in the event that you are in an accident. So if you get absolutely nothing else out of this, it's a vehicle of excess and it's basically a motorcycle. Next is that these are obviously rare cars. This is an entry-level or budget exotic / supercar. And some people are like, oh, it's a domestic, so it can't be a supercar. Listen, it's a V10 with a 6-speed manual transmission and no driver's aids. It is the most raw driving car there is. Look at any of the numbers for acceleration and performance. It's got over 500 horsepower for the Gen 3, and the numbers went up from there for the newer generations. I don't care how you look at it, it is a supercar. You cannot convince me otherwise. It is absurd. Now, this is the first car that I personally own that falls into that exotic supercar category. Obviously, this is on the more attainable end of that spectrum, but because of that, if you want to finance one of these, you can't do it through a traditional car loan because they're older, but they're also still extremely valuable. Even before the car market really took off post-COVID, these were still not necessarily cheap vehicles. So the way to finance them, and this is actually what I did, is to finance them as a collector's car or as a classic car. I went into it thinking that I could just finance it as a used car, but then they said it had to be like a 36-month payoff. So the monthly payment was actually going to be more than I paid for the mortgage on my house. So I pretty much told them, no way, I'm not doing that. That's absurd. I'm not paying. It was like $1,600 a month or something just to go to a car payment, plus you have to do insurance and stuff. But if you finance it as a collector's car or a classic car, they do a longer loan term so you can get a more reasonable monthly payment. That said, the monthly payment for mine is about $600 a month, which again, still not inexpensive, but a lot better than a lot of the other cars in this same performance bracket. The next item, which I just briefly mentioned, is insurance. This is actually a lot less expensive than I thought it would be to insure. Insurance rates are comparable to a C6 Z06 Corvette as well, and I think that is the most direct direct competitor for the Gen 3 Viper, but both of them, because of the price point, the types of people who could afford these are generally a little bit more responsible and have some concept of the consequences of their actions. So as a result of that, I think accident rates per mile are a little bit lower, which leads to insurance prices on these being lower than what you would actually expect them to be. Now, I have a clean driving record and I live in southern New Hampshire. Insurance rates here in general are not too expensive, but on my 2011 Mustang GT, I was paying about $1,400 a year. On the Viper, I'm paying about $1,600 a year. For comparison, a 370Z, when I got a quote for that, I couldn't find a quote cheaper than about $1,800 a year. So it's cheaper to insure a Dodge Viper and a C6 Z06 than it is to insure a 370Z, just because the accident rates on those are so high. The next tangent of it being an exotic car is that it is rare. It is obviously a lot more rare than the Mustang, a lot more rare than the Corvettes, and on the higher production years, they still only made roughly 1,000 of these per year. Most years closer to about 300 units per year. So for me personally, from the time I started looking until the time I was actually able to buy one, it was about a 3 to 3.5 month process of searching. So if you want one of these or any other car that's comparably rare, you gotta be patient, you gotta wait for one to come up. That's the reality of the situation. The other part of that is parts availability, which is something I didn't really think of prior to buying the car. Fortunately, this at the end of the day is a domestic car. So if you do need to special order parts, they are coming domestically, so it's not as bad as something like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini where you have to special order it and it has to ship from Italy. But parts availability is a concern. There's only 2 or 3 suppliers that I've found that consistently have parts for these cars. Most of the regular maintenance items like brakes and stuff, those aren't necessarily an issue, but anything that's a little more specialty, so like sensors or body panels or, things that don't have to routinely get placed that aren't as common, those are harder to come by. Dodge has discontinued the OEM parts for the Gen 3 at this point, and I'm assuming that they probably discontinued the Gen 4 and Gen 5 parts as well if they've already aged out. But there's also not enough of these made that there's consistent aftermarket support. So don't expect to go to like AutoZone or anything and find the Duralast brand. Quite frankly, I do see parts availability being an issue long term. But like I said, all the basics and the essentials, you can get them, but you're gonna have to pay accordingly. And part of that is the rarity of them, but the other part of it is that everything on this car, like I said, is built in excess. So everything is absolute overkill. For example, the brake rotors on this, they're 14.7 inches, which means for one set of rotors, they have to take half the iron from the entire mantle of the earth. They are colossal, and a lot of the things in the car are overbuilt to this extent. So not only do you have kind of the rarity markup, but you also have the fact that it's just a very bulky, over-engineered part. So there's a lot of cost and excess material associated with that as well. To give you an example, for just the front pads and rotors, I paid about $700 in parts and did the labor myself. Now granted, I got a track rated set of pad and rotors, so it was upgraded. If you wanted to get the absolute cheapest version possible, you could probably get away with it for about $450 to $500 of parts, but that is still not inexpensive. I could do all 4 corners on my WRX for about $300, and even my Mustang GT, when I got a track rated set of pads and rotors, it was about $450 to $500 for all 4 corners. So parts aren't cheap, but they're also not as obscenely overpriced as some of the foreign cars you could consider at that price point. Now, here's the good news about this, is that at the end of the day, it is still a Dodge. It's still a domestic car, and it is a relatively simple car mechanically. So the good news is, it is fairly reliable. It is a lot more reliable than a lot of the other supercars, especially of that generation and before. But on top of the reliability being better because it's a more simple vehicle, you also have, I think, better serviceability than a lot of the competitors. So for example, there's no engine out services or anything like you get in a lot of the Ferraris of the similar age. And I don't think the service intervals are as often. And even mine, for example, when I first bought it, I did a video, which I'll link below, where I described everything that was wrong with the car. And one of the issues was that the previous owner didn't do any like the routine maintenance by age or by mileage. So I still have the original wires, I still have the original spark plugs, stuff like that. But even with the original spark plugs and stuff, the car still runs great. And granted, it was never driven in rain or anything, that helps. But a lot of other supercars can get really finicky if you don't routinely change those things every 5 to 7 years. This one, with the original spark plugs at 3 times that age, still runs great with all the original equipment, does not misfire, doesn't skip a beat, and is super strong. So not only is it reliable, but it's also simple enough that you or a shop that you like to go to can probably figure out how to work on it, even if they're not really a specialty shop. But I'm going to add an asterisk here, because they can work on it if their lift is low enough.